Caleb Mercer's smile disappeared. The young woman standing across from him had taken what he meant as a mocking challenge and turned it into something that sounded almost like a blood oath. He looked at her hands again. Clara Whitmore was 27 years old, small for a woman who claimed she could repair a failing ranch. But there was nothing delicate about those hands. Her fingers were narrow, yet the knuckles were thick from years of hard work. Old scars crossed her palms. Fresh calluses covered the places where softer skin should have been. Caleb leaned back against the rough kitchen table. At 36, he had lived long enough on the Wyoming frontier to know what winter did to confidence. And winter was coming. "You can use the cot in the tack room," he said quietly. "You eat what I eat. But I am not doing the heavy work for you." Clara held his gaze. "If you quit," Caleb continued, "you walk the 5 miles back to Red Creek on your own." "I am not quitting." She gathered the papers she had spread across his table and folded them carefully. "I will need a shovel, a plumb line, the block and tackle from the hayloft, and every piece of dry black locust timber you have hidden in that shed." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You have been here less than an hour. That was enough time to see the east wall." She slipped the papers into her coat pocket and walked out. Caleb watched the door close behind her. Then he picked up the oily rag beside his saddle and went back to cleaning the leather. He was certain she would be gone before Sunday. Clara crossed the yard toward the barn. The Broken Spur Ranch sat in a wide valley west of Red Creek, Wyoming territory, where the open prairie climbed toward dark mountains in the distance. It was late September of 1888. The afternoon air already carried the first hard edge of autumn. Cottonwood leaves along the creek had turned gold. Frost had appeared twice on the grass before sunrise. Clara estimated they had perhaps 8 weeks before winter settled permanently over the valley. Maybe less. She stopped beside the east wall of the enormous barn. The structure leaned so badly that Caleb had braced part of it with temporary poles. Clara placed one palm against the weathered boards. The timber groaned beneath her touch. She closed her eyes. For a moment she could almost smell her grandfather's workshop again. She remembered leaning over his drafting table as a child while he explained the faded drawings from his years building military bridges after the Civil War. He had taught her more than measurements. He had taught her how to understand weight, how to understand pressure, how to understand failure. "Find the bedrock, Clara," he used to say. "Everything else is just waiting for gravity to win." She opened her eyes. A rusted shovel leaned against one of the stalls. Clara took it. Then she walked to the eastern edge of the barn and drove the iron blade deep into the ground. The work had begun. The first 3 days tested every limit of Clara's determination. The soil beneath the east wall was worse than she expected. Loose shale lay over deep, sandy earth. Every time she removed 12 inches of dirt, 6 inches slid back into the trench. She built temporary retaining boards from scraps of pine, but even those shifted. Her hands blistered the first day. The blisters tore open on the second. By the third morning, she had wrapped both palms with strips cut from an old cotton undershirt. She never complained. She began working when the eastern horizon first turned gray. She stopped only when evening shadows stretched across the prairie. Caleb did not help. He worked nearby. Sometimes he repaired fence. Sometimes he broke horses in the corral. Sometimes he carried feed into the barn as if Clara and the trench did not exist. But he watched. He expected her to throw down the shovel. He expected anger, tears, excuses. He expected to wake one morning and discover that she had walked back to Red Creek. Instead, every time he looked toward the barn, he saw the same small figure lifting another shovel full of earth. On the 4th afternoon, Caleb passed the trench on his way to the house. He stopped. The excavation ran almost the entire length of the barn's eastern foundation. Clara stood below ground level, breathing hard. "You are going to bury yourself in that hole." She leaned against the shovel. Dust covered her face. Sweat had darkened the collar of her pale blue work dress. I am finding bedrock, Mr. Mercer. I told you there is no bedrock there. Caleb shook his head. 5 men tried to brace that wall before you came along. Every one of them said the same thing. The ground is soft. They were looking for a floor. Caleb frowned. Clara pointed toward the far end of the trench. I am looking for an anchor. She climbed several steps toward him and knelt beside the exposed soil. The loose shale stops about 12 feet down. Underneath it is granite. I found the first shelf this morning. Caleb stared. Clara continued. We do not need to rebuild the entire foundation. We sink 4 black locust posts down to the granite. Then we create diagonal support from the posts toward the wall. She drew a line in the dirt with one finger. The ground is not weak. It is moving. There is a difference. Caleb crouched beside the trench. Clara pointed again. The sand slides east whenever the ground becomes saturated. The original foundation follows it. We need to give the barn something the soil cannot move. Caleb studied the exposed layers. The geometry was simple once she explained it. More importantly, it made sense. This was not rancher's guesswork. It was engineering. He looked down at Clara. She was trembling slightly from exhaustion. Her eyes remained steady. Black locust is heavy. I know. Those posts weigh close to 400 pounds. I know. You cannot move them by yourself. I will use the block and tackle from your hayloft. Caleb remained silent for several seconds. Then he reached into the back of his belt and pulled out a clean leather work glove. He dropped it into the trench. It landed beside Clara's boot. He threw down the second glove. Use those. Clara looked up. Caleb turned away before she could answer. I do not need you bleeding all over my shovels. Clara picked up the gloves. They were much too large. But they were thick and warm. She put them on and returned to work. By the second week, the physical cost became worse. Yet something else changed. A rhythm settled over the broken spur. At night, Clara and Caleb ate together in the ranch house. The meals were simple. Salt pork, beans, cornbread, potatoes when Caleb had them, coffee strong enough to make Clara wince during the first few evenings. They rarely discussed anything except the ranch, but the silence between them slowly stopped feeling hostile. It became shared. One evening, Clara sat beside the stove, drawing a diagram on brown wrapping paper. Caleb sat across the room repairing a bridle. The water is not poisoned, Clara said. Caleb looked up. What? The well. He returned his attention to the leather. Water tastes like iron. Sounds poisoned enough to me. It is confused. Caleb stopped sewing. Confused water. That is a new one. Clara ignored the sarcasm. The iron casing you put into the well is cracked. How do you know? The metallic taste only gets strong near the end of summer. Caleb looked at her. She tapped the drawing. The crack must be level with a limestone seam. When the water table drops, sediment enters through the damaged casing. That is what you are tasting. So how do we unconfuse it? This time there was no mockery in Caleb's voice, only curiosity. Clara noticed. She tried not to smile. We remove the damaged iron casing. We line that section with fired clay brick and seal it with river mud mixed with fine limestone powder. The clay expands slightly when it stays wet. It should close the gap. Caleb considered the idea. Before he could respond, someone struck the front door. 3 hard knocks echoed through the house. Caleb stood immediately. His hand moved instinctively toward the revolver hanging near his coat. Then he opened the door. Elias Boone stood on the porch. Elias was a cattleman in his early 60s who owned land on the opposite side of the valley. His gray beard was wet with mist. His face looked worried. Evening, Caleb. Elias. Caleb stepped aside. What brings you across the valley this late? The sky. Elias removed his hat. He nodded respectfully toward Clara. Ma'am? Clara returned the greeting. Elias sat down heavily. The barometer at Henderson's general store dropped hard since noon. Telegraph operator says pressure is falling all across this part of the territory. Caleb's expression changed. Storm. A bad one. Elias rubbed his hands together. Cold autumn rain, maybe hail higher up, the kind that washes roads out and drowns calves standing 10 feet from their mothers. When? Tomorrow evening, maybe sooner. Clara's head snapped toward the window. Her trench, it was completely open. The 4 huge locust posts waited beside it. If heavy rain filled that excavation before the posts were secured, the sandy soil would turn into mud. The eastern foundation would not simply settle. It could collapse. How much rain? Clara asked. Elias looked at her, surprised by the authority in her voice. Enough to float a wagon if the creek rises. If you have tools outside, I would bring them in. After Elias left, the ranch house became completely silent. Caleb stared toward the barn. He understood what an open trench meant. We fill it back in. Clara turned toward him. Caleb's voice was flat, defeated. We put the dirt back before the rain. We lose the work, but we save the barn. No. Clara. It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed. If that trench fills with water, the barn comes down. If we fill it with loose soil, water will move through it anyway. Maybe it survives tomorrow. Maybe it even survives winter. But by spring, the wall starts moving again. I'm not losing my barn. Then we finish the reinforcement. Caleb stepped closer. Those posts weigh 400 pounds each. I know. You cannot control them alone. Then help me. His jaw tightened. I did not agree to join your suicide mission. Clara did not move. She thought about the small boarding room in Red Creek. She thought about her grandmother lying beneath 2 thin blankets. She remembered the sound of the old woman's breathing. She remembered her grandfather's voice. Stand where the ground is strongest. Do not move simply because someone stronger tells you to. My grandmother will not survive the winter without her medicine. Caleb's anger faded. Clara continued. I owe $40 to the druggist in Red Creek. He has been supplying her medicine on credit. She swallowed. I promised him I would pay before the first snow. Caleb said nothing. I came here because $40 might not mean much to some people, but it means everything to me. She folded the drawings. I am putting those posts in tomorrow, Caleb. With you or without you. She walked toward the tack room and closed the door. The next morning, the sky looked like bruised iron. The wind smelled of wet soil. Clara was in the trench before sunrise. She attached the block and tackle to one of the strongest beams inside the barn. Then she wrapped hemp rope around the first locust post. The pulley system groaned. Clara pulled. Every muscle in her back protested. Slowly, the heavy timber lifted from the ground. She needed to lower it precisely into the hole she had cut into the granite. But the wind was already catching the suspended post. It swung. Clara tried to stabilize it. Her boots slipped near the trench. She fell to one knee. The rope burned across Caleb's oversized gloves. The post swung toward the barn wall. Then 2 powerful hands caught it. Clara looked up. Caleb stood inside the trench. His coat was gone. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows. Lower it when I tell you. He pressed his shoulder against the timber. Caleb, do not waste time arguing. He forced the post toward the granite socket. Now! Clara released the rope. The post dropped. It struck the stone with a deep, satisfying thud. They did not celebrate. They moved immediately to the second post. The sky darkened. Large drops began striking the dry earth. By the time they raised the third post, rain had become a cold curtain. The bottom of the trench turned to thick mud. Caleb's boots sank almost to the ankles. Clara's fingers became numb. The pulley groaned beneath the weight. "Hold it steady!" Caleb shouted. He braced himself against the wall of the trench and guided the third post. "Now!" Clara lowered it. The timber settled into place. 3 posts. 1 remained. Then the storm broke completely. Rain fell in sheets. Loose dirt washed from the top of the excavation. The barn groaned. Caleb looked upward. The eastern wall had moved. "Clara!" She saw it. A gap opened between 2 boards, then another. Her stomach dropped. She climbed toward the wall and pushed her hand against the lower crossbeam. The timber crumbled beneath her fingers. Rot. Far worse than she had calculated. The diagonal braces were supposed to attach to that beam, but there was no solid wood left. If they bolted the braces to it, the pressure would tear the barn apart. Her plan had failed. Clara stood in the rain. For the first time since arriving at the broken spur, panic entered her face. "We cannot attach the braces." Caleb climbed out beside her. "The wood is dead." Lightning flashed across the valley. The barn groaned again. Caleb saw something in Clara's expression that he had not seen before. Fear. Not fear for herself. Fear that everything she had endured had been for nothing. Then Caleb looked at the posts. He looked at the wall. He looked at the heavy timber stacked beside the barn. "We do not pull the wall." Clara stared at him. "What?" "We push it." He ran toward the woodpile. "Your grandfather built bridges, right?" "Yes, bridges do not only use tension." Clara's eyes widened. "Compression." Caleb dragged a thick, unfinished log toward them. "We do not bolt the brace to the wall. We wedge this between the locust posts and the foundation. Make an arch." Clara's mind raced. Caleb pointed through the rain. The harder the barn pushes down, the harder the wedge pushes back. She saw the geometry. Reverse load. No strong attachment point required. Only weight. Only gravity. And gravity was exactly what had been destroying the barn. Now they could use it. "Yes." Clara grabbed the saw. "Help me cut the angle." They worked like 2 halves of the same machine. Caleb held the timber. Clara calculated the cut. They shaped a huge wedge. Then they lowered it into the trench between the deep posts and the failing barn wall. Caleb grabbed a sledgehammer. He swung. The first strike echoed across the yard. The wedge moved. He swung again and again. Each blow drove the timber deeper. The barn groaned, but the sound changed. It became quieter. Caleb raised the hammer one final time. He struck with everything he had. The wedge locked into place. The barn settled. Then it stopped. Clara stared. Rain streamed across her face. The wall did not move. Caleb dropped the hammer into the mud. He leaned against the post, breathing heavily. Clara slid down the side of the trench and sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. They simply watched the barn. Still. Solid. Standing. Caleb turned his head. Clara was covered with mud. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks. Blood had soaked through one glove. But she was smiling, not a triumphant smile. A quiet one. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, something heavier than the timber they had moved, and perhaps more permanent. The storm finally weakened shortly before dawn. Heavy rain became cold mist. Clara tried to stand. Her legs had spent hours in freezing mud. They failed. She fell forward. Caleb caught her. She attempted to pull away. "I can walk." "No, you cannot." Before she could object, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed far less than he expected. Even soaked with rain and mud, she seemed almost weightless. Clara was too exhausted to argue. Her head slowly rested against his shoulder. Caleb carried her into the house. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. He placed her carefully on his own bed near the far wall and covered her with a thick wool blanket. Then he rebuilt the fire. Only after the room warmed did Caleb return to the kitchen table. Clara's leather-bound notebook sat beside the lamp. He hesitated before touching it. He told himself he was looking for the name of her grandmother's doctor or someone in Red Creek he could contact if Clara developed pneumonia. He opened the book. Instead, he found a life. The first pages contained copies of her grandfather's engineering sketches. Truss bridges, load-bearing walls, drainage channels, soil displacement, windbreak designs. Her own handwriting filled the margins. She had translated military engineering into frontier survival. Barn braces, cistern seals, snow load calculations, well linings, compression arches. She had not guessed what was wrong with his ranch. She had studied it, measured it, thought about it. Caleb turned toward the final pages. There he found a list. Room rent in Red Creek, coal, bread, medicine. Then the largest amount, Pike's Drugstore, $40, underlined twice. Beside the total, Clara had written one sentence. I will not let Grandma freeze to death. Caleb slowly closed the notebook. 10 years earlier, he and his younger brother Samuel had come west from Missouri. They bought the broken spur with nearly every dollar they had saved. They built fences until their hands bled. They slept in the barn before the ranch house had a roof. They believed hard work could solve anything. Then came their second winter. Samuel developed pneumonia. Caleb rode through snow to Red Creek looking for medicine. He had no cash. The druggist at that time refused him credit. Caleb returned empty-handed. Samuel died 3 days later. Caleb had never forgiven the town. He had never forgiven the ranch. Most of all, he had never forgiven himself. From that winter forward, he trusted work more than people. He stopped asking for help. He stopped offering it easily. He treated the land like an enemy that had to be beaten into submission. Now he looked at Clara, asleep beneath his blanket. She was fighting just as hard, but not against the land. She listened to it. She repaired what was failing. She was trying to save the only family she had left. And suddenly Caleb understood something he had refused to understand for 10 years. Strength and isolation were not the same thing. Clara slept for almost a day and a half. When she finally opened her eyes, late afternoon sunlight crossed the floor. The house was warm. Coffee and bacon filled the room with their smell. She sat up quickly. The barn! Caleb entered carrying firewood. He stopped when he saw her awake. It is still standing, Clara exhaled. The wall did not move an inch. She swung her feet toward the floor. We need to start on the well. You need to eat. The well cannot wait. It can wait 1 day. Winter will not. Neither will a fever. Caleb placed coffee and hot food on the table. Eat. Clara looked at him. There was no mockery in his voice, only concern. She sat. Thank you for coming into the trench. Someone had to keep you from dropping a 400-pound post through my barn. Clara almost smiled. Then she became serious. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Caleb. She looked up. If we are rebuilding this place together, you can stop calling me Mr. Mercer. A small smile appeared. All right, Caleb. The following morning, a thin layer of frost covered the ground. They began work on the well. The old iron casing was heavy, rusted, and coated with slime. Clara built a tripod above the opening and attached the pulley. This thing is going to fight us. Caleb took the main rope. Let it. Clara positioned herself behind him. On 3. They pulled. The casing groaned. Slowly, inch by painful inch, the rusted iron emerged. They dragged it aside. Then Clara prepared fired clay bricks and mixed river mud with powdered limestone. Caleb spread a thick layer over the first brick. Clara shook her head. You are using too much. I raise cattle. I am not a bricklayer. The clay does not care. She stepped behind him. Then she placed one hand over his and adjusted the angle of the trowel. "Smooth it." Caleb became still. "If you leave air pockets, water will find them." Her hand rested against his. "Water always finds weak places." For several seconds, neither moved. Cold wind crossed the yard. Caleb felt none of it. He cleared his throat. Then he smoothed the clay. "Like that?" Clara removed her hand. "Exactly like that." They worked until sunset. When they finished, the water below looked dark and still. "We let the clay set for 2 days," Clara said. "Then we lower the new pipe." And the iron taste, gone, if I am right. Before Caleb could answer, hoofbeats approached. Elias Boone rode into the yard fast. His horse's breath formed white clouds in the cold air. He did not dismount. "Caleb." Caleb looked up. "What happened? I just came from Red Creek." Elias looked toward Clara. "I saw Amos Pike." Clara's face changed. Pike now owned the town drugstore and rented several rooms behind it. Clara's grandmother had been staying in one of those rooms because it was close to the medicine she needed. "What did he say?" "He is moving your grandmother tomorrow morning." Clara dropped the trowel. "No." "He says he needs the room." "We had an agreement." "Pike says the weather changed." Elias glanced toward the mountains. "The telegraph office received a warning from Cheyenne. A major snowstorm is moving south. They expect it here Thursday night." It was Tuesday. Clara went pale. If her grandmother were taken to the county charity ward during a blizzard, she might not survive the weekend. "I have to go back." Clara stepped toward the road. Caleb stopped her. "You do not have the $40. "I will find it." "How?" "I will beg if I have to. I will work as a housemaid." "I will sign a year's contract." Caleb put both hands on her shoulders. "Clara, look at me." Her eyes were shining. "Our agreement was $40 when the ranch was repaired before the first snow. The well is not finished. We tested early. The clay needs 2 full days. It will have close to that. What if the water still tastes like iron?" Caleb turned toward Elias. "Ride back to Red Creek." Elias waited. "Tell Pike that if he moves Mrs. Whitmore anywhere, he answers to me." Clara stared. "Tell him Caleb Mercer will be in Red Creek Thursday morning with $40 cash." Elias nodded. "I will tell him. But Pike is stubborn." "So am I." Elias turned his horse and rode away. Caleb looked toward the darkening sky. "Tomorrow we seal every draft in this house. Caleb, Thursday morning we test the well. If the water is clean, the job is complete. And if it is not," Caleb looked at her, "it will be." "You cannot know that. Your grandfather built bridges. You built a wall that survived a flood." His expression softened. "I trust your foundation." Wednesday arrived gray and bitter. Wind slipped through every crack in the ranch house. Clara mixed pine resin ash and fiber into thick sealant. She pressed it between the logs. Caleb worked beside her. He did not question her method once. By evening, the drafts were gone. Heat from the iron stove finally reached the corners of the room. They sat beside the fire. Caleb greased his winter boots. Clara studied the scarred skin of her hands. "You have a mind for holding things together," Caleb said. Clara looked at the fire. "A structure usually fails because somebody asks it to carry weight it was never designed to carry." Caleb stopped moving. Clara continued quietly. "People are not that different." The words stayed in the room. Caleb looked at his hands. "My brother Samuel died because I could not keep him warm." Clara turned toward him. Caleb had not spoken those words aloud to anyone in years. "I was 26, thought I was tougher than anything this country could throw at me." His jaw tightened. "When Samuel got sick, I told him I would fix it." Caleb stared into the fire. "I could not." Clara waited. So, after he died, I decided I would never depend on anyone again. You blamed yourself. I still do. The land did not kill your brother. Caleb looked at her. The land is not your enemy, Caleb. She spoke gently. It is just honest. It tells you what it can carry. It tells you when something is wrong. It tells you where the weak points are. She looked around the house. You only have to listen. Caleb leaned back. I think I am finally learning. Thursday morning arrived with the sound of wind screaming against the house. The storm had come early. Snow moved sideways across the ranch. Within minutes, tracks disappeared. Clara and Caleb wrapped themselves in wool coats and pushed through the storm toward the well. The tripod still stood. The rope whipped in the wind. The clay has not had 2 full days, Clara shouted. It has had enough. Caleb pointed toward the bucket. Lower it. Clara released the brake. The bucket dropped into the darkness. They heard the splash. Clara began turning the crank. Her arms hurt. Caleb placed his hands over hers. Together, they raised it. The bucket appeared. Caleb set it on the frozen ground. Clara knelt. She dipped a tin cup into the water. It was clear. No cloudy limestone. No reddish sediment. No mud. She drank. The water was freezing cold and sweet. The metallic taste was gone. Clara looked up. A bright smile spread across her face. It worked. Caleb looked toward the barn. The east wall stood against the full force of the blizzard. No movement, no groaning. The compression brace held exactly as they hoped. Caleb turned back toward Clara. The ranch is fixed. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. Now we fix the rest. Caleb harnessed his 2 strongest draft horses to the freight wagon. Clara expected him to saddle riding horses. Instead, he brought out the wagon. Why the wagon? You will see. She climbed onto the seat. Caleb threw a thick buffalo robe over her shoulders. Then he climbed beside her. The trip to Red Creek was brutal. Snow had already covered much of the road. The horses pushed through growing drifts. Caleb kept his eyes on the faint line between fence posts. Clara held the robe around both of them when the wind became strongest. 5 miles normally took less than an hour. That morning it took nearly 3. When they reached Red Creek, the streets were deserted. Smoke rose from chimneys. Windows had been boarded against the wind. Caleb stopped in front of Pike's drugstore. Stay here. No. Clara, she is my grandmother. She climbed down. I'm going inside. The bell above the drugstore door rang softly. Warm air smelled of dried mint, camphor coal smoke, and medicine. Amos Pike stood behind the counter. He was in his late 50s, narrow-faced, with wire spectacles and a permanently tight mouth. His eyes widened. Mercer. Caleb approached the counter. He reached into his coat and removed a leather pouch. Then he emptied it. 4 $10 gold pieces struck the glass. $40. Pike looked at the coins. Paid in full. Pike slowly pulled the money toward him. The debt is settled. Clara released the breath she had been holding. But I told Elias Boone that I still need the back room. Clara stared at him. What? I have travelers trapped here by the storm, paying travelers. You cannot put my grandmother outside. I am not putting her outside. The county has a ward. In this weather, Pike stiffened. I have a business to run. Caleb's voice became very quiet. You are not moving her to the county ward. I own the room. Caleb nodded. That is true. He looked at Clara. We are taking her with us. Clara turned toward him. We cannot. Yes, we can. Caleb, she cannot survive 3 hours in that wagon. She will not be cold. Caleb walked outside. A minute later, he returned carrying something so heavy that Pike moved from behind the counter to see it. It was a small cast-iron heating stove. New. Clara stared at it. Caleb set it on the floor. Then he returned outside and brought in thick wool blankets and a heavy quilt. I bought the stove 2 weeks ago. Clara could barely speak. 2 weeks after I read your notebook. You read my notebook? I was trying to find the name of someone to contact because you nearly froze yourself to death. Despite everything, Clara almost laughed. Caleb continued. Yesterday, while you were sealing the north wall, I cut a stove opening through the roof of the spare room. Clara stared at him. The firebox is ready. He pointed outside. I can secure this stove in the wagon bed and run the pipe through the canvas cover. We keep a small fire going during the ride. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She will be wrapped in wool and that quilt. She will be warmer in my wagon than she is in Pike's drafty back room. Clara finally understood. Caleb had not come to Red Creek merely to pay the debt. He had planned to bring her grandmother home to the Broken Spur. The tears came before she could stop them. Caleb looked uncomfortable. He had faced wild bulls with more confidence than he faced a crying woman. Clara. She shook her head. I am fine. You do not look fine. I said I am fine. Then she suddenly threw her arms around him. Caleb froze. After a second, his arms slowly closed around her. Clara stepped back quickly and wiped her face. I need to get Grandma. I will prepare the wagon. Mrs. Whitmore was 72. She looked even smaller, wrapped beneath the layers of blankets. Her skin was pale. Her breathing was shallow. Clara sat beside her in the covered wagon while Caleb drove. The stove radiated steady heat. A metal shield protected the bedding from sparks. Caleb stopped twice during the journey to add small pieces of dry wood. The return trip was slow, but this time Clara did not fear the snow. She held her grandmother's hand, warm, alive. When the Broken Spur finally appeared through the storm, Clara felt something she had not expected. Relief. Not because the journey was over, because the ranch looked like home. The barn stood firm. Smoke rose from the chimney. Warm lamplight glowed through the windows. The place that had seemed half dead 2 weeks earlier now looked ready to survive winter. Caleb carried Mrs. Whitmore inside. The spare room waited. Fresh blankets covered the bed. Firewood was stacked near the stove. A small table stood beside the mattress. Clara noticed a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. They were dried autumn asters. She looked at Caleb. Did you put those there? He avoided her eyes. The room looked empty. Clara said nothing. Caleb lit the fire. Within minutes, warmth filled the room. Mrs. Whitmore's breathing slowly became more regular. Clara placed the medicine beside the bed. Her grandmother opened her eyes briefly. Clara? I'm here. Where are we? Clara looked toward Caleb. Somewhere warm. Mrs. Whitmore smiled weakly. Then I suppose you finally found what you were looking for. Clara did not understand exactly what she meant, but Caleb turned away, as if suddenly very interested in adjusting the stove. Later that night, the blizzard hammered the windows. Inside, the house remained warm. Clara closed the door to the spare room and walked into the kitchen. Caleb sat at the table with a cup of coffee. She sat across from him. She is sleeping. Good. Her color is better. Caleb nodded. The silence between them was different now. Weeks earlier, silence had been a wall. Then it became neutral ground. Now it felt almost intimate. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. The barn is standing. Caleb looked at her. The water is clean. He nodded. The debt is paid. Yes, our agreement is finished. Something changed in Caleb's expression. The first day you came here, I told you something. Clara looked down. You said if I repaired the ranch before winter, you would marry me. I did. You were making fun of me. I was. You were trying to scare me away. Yes. Clara looked at him. You were very unpleasant. I have been told. I imagine often. More than once, a small laugh escaped her. Caleb's face softened. I was a fool. Clara became serious. I thought surviving out here meant becoming harder than everything around me. He placed his hand on the table. I thought if I needed somebody, that meant I was weak. Clara watched his hand, large, calloused, scarred. The same hand that had caught the swinging post. The same hand that had held the sledgehammer. The same hand that had lifted her from the mud. The same hand that had guided horses through a blizzard to save her grandmother. I was joking that day, Caleb said. His voice lowered. I am not joking now. Clara's breath caught. He did not grab her, he did not reach across the table, he simply left his hand there. An invitation. Nothing more. Clara looked toward the hall where her grandmother slept, then toward the fire, then back at Caleb. She placed her scarred hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers. I do not want a marriage because of a debt, Clara said. Neither do I. I do not want you thinking you rescued me. Caleb shook his head. I watched you move half a mountain with a shovel. I am not foolish enough to believe you needed rescuing. Clara smiled. What do you want then? Caleb thought for a moment. A partner. The answer surprised her with its simplicity. A partner? Someone who knows when a wall needs bracing. Clara laughed softly. That is your proposal? I am finished. Good. Caleb shifted in his chair. Someone who knows the difference between soft ground and moving ground. Better. Someone who will argue with me when I deserve it. That could become a full-time occupation. I suspected that. She squeezed his hand. Caleb smiled. Then the humor faded. And someone who understands that two people can carry something neither of them should have been carrying alone. Clara became still. Outside, wind howled across the Wyoming prairie, snow piled against the barn. Inside, the fire burned steadily. I can work with that, she whispered. Caleb's eyes held hers. Is that a yes? It is not a no, Clara. She let him suffer for several seconds. Then she smiled. Yes. Caleb released a breath. Clara tilted her head. You look relieved. I would rather face another collapsing barn than ask that question twice. From the spare room they heard a faint voice. You could have asked it better. Clara's eyes widened. Caleb stared toward the hallway. Mrs. Whitmore had apparently been awake. Clara covered her mouth to keep from laughing. Caleb leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I knew bringing her here would cost me. The old woman's voice came again. $40 was only the beginning. Clara finally laughed. Caleb joined her. It was the first time she had heard him laugh without bitterness. The sound changed the house. Winter settled over the broken spur during the following weeks. It was a hard winter. Snow buried fence lines. 2 calves had to be brought into the barn during one particularly cold night. The creek froze. The road to Red Creek disappeared beneath drifts more than once. But the barn remained standing. The new wells stayed clear. The sealed walls kept the ranch house warm. Mrs. Whitmore slowly regained her strength. And something else happened. Caleb stopped doing everything alone. When Elias Boone came asking for help repairing a wind-damaged roof, Caleb went. When another rancher lost cattle during a storm, Caleb joined the search. When Clara suggested building snow fencing along the western ridge, he listened, most of the time. They still argued, frequently, but the arguments were different. Caleb no longer treated disagreement like disobedience. Clara no longer believed accepting help made her less capable. By Christmas, the broken spur no longer looked broken. Caleb repaired the front porch. Clara drew plans for a larger cistern. Mrs. Whitmore insisted on making molasses cookies, despite Clara's objections. Elias Boone brought a small pine tree from the foothills. Someone found red ribbon in Red Creek. They placed the tree beside the stove. On Christmas Eve, Caleb stood on the porch while snow fell gently beyond the lantern light. Clara joined him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Caleb looked toward the barn. "The first time I saw you standing beside that wall, I thought you were crazy." "You told me that." "I thought you would last 3 days." "You also told me that." "I was wrong." Clara folded her arms against the cold. "You were wrong about several things." "I am noticing a pattern," she smiled. Caleb looked toward the dark mountains. "Samuel loved Christmas." Clara waited. "He used to hang pine branches everywhere, even in the barn." Caleb smiled faintly. "I used to tell him it was ridiculous." "Was it?" "Probably." Clara slipped her hand into his. "But you miss it." "Yes." The word came easily now. Caleb looked down at their joined hands. "I spent 10 years believing that remembering him meant carrying the worst day of his life." Clara rested her shoulder against his arm. "Maybe remembering someone should include the good days, too." Caleb nodded. Behind them, the door opened. Mrs. Whitmore called out, "If you two intend to freeze on that porch after everything we did to make this house warm, I am going to be personally offended." Clara laughed. Caleb opened the door. "Yes, ma'am." They stepped inside. The firelight filled the room. The wind moved gently across the prairie, and for the first time in years, Caleb did not hear the Wyoming winter as an enemy approaching his door. He heard weather. Nothing more. The frontier had taught him the wrong lesson for a long time. He had believed survival meant becoming harder than the land. He had believed a man proved his strength by carrying everything himself. But a barn built on unstable ground eventually leaned. A well with a hidden crack eventually became contaminated. A house with enough small gaps eventually surrendered its warmth. People were no different. Pride could hold for years, until one storm exposed the weakness beneath it. Clara had arrived at the broken spur believing she needed $40. Caleb had believed he needed someone desperate enough to repair a dying ranch. Neither understood the real bargain. She taught him that strength did not mean refusing help. He taught her that accepting another person's hand did not erase independence. Together they learned something the Wyoming frontier had been trying to teach them all along. No foundation survives because it is never tested. It survives because the weight is carried correctly. Outside snow continued gathering against the eastern wall of the barn. The wall remained straight. The deep locust posts held against the granite. The compression arch carried the load. Inside the ranch house, Mrs. Whitmore slept peacefully in a warm room. Clara sat beside Caleb near the fire. Their hands rested together between them. Tomorrow there would be cattle to feed, wood to split, ice to break, repairs to finish. There would be disagreements, failures, another spring flood someday, more winters, more weight. But neither of them would carry the heavy end of the beam alone again. And the Broken Spur Ranch, once held together by stubbornness and failing timber, finally became something stronger. A home. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Clara from the beginning? And if you believe the strongest homes are built together, like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories.